They've been spiking the purple Kool-Aid since October of 2012. And who wants to listen to that? It's the EMAWdio podcast. And now, here are your hosts, Grant Tommy and Doug Rocheleau.
Welcome to the EMAWdio podcast. I'm your host, Grant Tommy, and this episode, no Doug, as Season 5 starts for the EMAWdio podcast here. It's going to have a little bit of a different look in the first two episodes. We will be doing preview episodes of the opponents in front of us, but before we do that, special thanks to having the opportunity once again from Tim Fitzgerald and his staff at GoPowerCat.com to be able to have a fifth rendition of the EMAWdio podcast. But the Texas Tech Red Raiders come to Manhattan this Saturday, and as I mentioned, being a preview show, to do so, I've enlisted the help of a long friend of the podcast, Seth Youngman, the site manager at StakingThePlains.com. Seth, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I think that we're past, blog friends. I think that we're actually just friends, right?
Yeah, no, I think so too. Maybe I didn't enunciate well enough. I was saying longtime friend, because this is probably at least the fifth time at least I've interviewed you, and it's that's what's been so fruitful about the podcasting experience over the 5+ years that I've been doing it, is developing these relationships. And Seth, we do have Lubbock on our sights next year, my wife and I, for the annual road game that we like to make. But speaking of road games, it is a road game for the Texas Tech Red Raiders, and what I'm curious to know from your perspective, Seth, is just coming off of a 3-game losing streak, are the Red Raiders, and just sort of maybe some of the upperclassmen, knowing how the last 3 or 4 or 2 seasons have gone with the hot starts and trailing off at the end. Where do you think this Texas Tech Red Raider team is emotionally at the current state?
Boy, that's a good question. And I'm not totally sure. So I guess there's one caveat, which is, but now I think that it's important to kind of understand too that we played 3 ranked opponents. Oklahoma being the best team, and Iowa State, of course, being, I think they're ranked now, and Texas being ranked. So it's not like it's been like past seasons that you've lost the teams that you shouldn't have. So they've been within one score for pretty much each one of those games. Granted, 2 of them were at home, and really were within one score in Ames until Bowman throws just kind of this weird pass that ended up being a safety, and then they scored quickly, and so it ended up, the score looked a lot worse than what the game actually was. So maybe just from how they're feeling standpoint, hey, look, maybe we feel like that we're pretty good because we were pretty darn close in all of these games, and one of them was in Ames, and they played really well on the road too. They played well at TCU, played really well at Oklahoma State. So, I tend to think that this group is pretty resilient. Kingsbury's kind of been talking about how the team has to be pretty resilient overall, and I tend to think that they've kind of taken that in. I think that they've played hard to the end on every game. So, I know that doesn't count as a win in the win-loss ledger, but it's, I don't think that they've given up or anything like that. So I think they're probably feeling pretty good.
Well, I think certainly for me, for an outsider looking in, an outside perspective, if you will, I do think Texas Tech passes the eye test a little better than they have in years past, and that's something I'll probably try to touch on later. But you mentioned Alan Bowman throwing the weird pass, ends up in a safety up in Ames. But when he hit the ground running, whichever, I forget which, I want to say it was the Oklahoma State game was his sort of breakout game or debut game. Am I correct with that one? Or
no, he actually had to start playing the very first game of the year. So McClain Carter was the starter, the named starter, and he lasted maybe 2 series before he had a high ankle sprain and was basically, he's been out since. He tried to play, I can't remember what game he tried to play, but it didn't work out. He still couldn't push off the ankle. And so he got shelved again. I mean, he came in for maybe like a series or something like that. And so it's been either Jet Duffy and or Alan Bowman, who really technically are the second and or third team quarterback based upon the preseason depth chart, which was McClain Carter and then Alan Bowman and then Jet Duffy. So it's weird that. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask was I don't remember which of the games was Bowman's breakout game, but I think the rest of the conference saw that. I think if I remember correctly, he broke one of Patrick Mahomes' freshman records or something. But I think that from a league's perspective, we're like, oh great, Tech's got their next guy when that happened. Yeah. So it was really sad to see. Of course, he's been battling this collapsed lung issue, which, as all indications are, he's not playing anymore the rest of the season, which I would hope not. I would think, much like a concussion, it's one thing to come back from one collapsed lung, but to come back from two, and that you probably just don't want to mess up someone's health with that being the case. So in comes Jet Duffy, and in that Oklahoma game, of course, it was a heck of a game with Bowman playing the first half. And yeah, when Duffy comes in off the bench, he looks a little out of sorts, a little uncomfortable. But I think having to step up in that spotlight in those conditions 2 weeks in a row, of course, then last week being the Texas game, I think personally I could see some growth, and you could definitely tell from a mental standpoint, the kid was trying as hard as he could not to mess up or not to make mistakes, but certainly the spotlight was quite huge. What kind of growth have you seen out of Jet Duffy in spite of being thrown into those precarious situations?
So he got thrown into the TCU fire, which is never an easy place to play, and it's always tough going against their defense. And basically, he only completed some really big plays. And so he was really kind of limited. He didn't kind of move the chains like he kind of really wanted, or like you've seen from Texas Tech quarterbacks. And so he kind of did the same thing against Oklahoma. He didn't really move the chains. There were so many 3-and-outs, and the offense kind of stalled. And maybe that was, partly Oklahoma just playing good defense. But then against Texas, you kind of saw where he was completing the intermediate throws, and he was using his arm more than his legs, which is something that he's really, really talented at. And so I think that's kind of been one of Kingsbury's things, which is to say, hey, look, your legs are great. You can move the ball with your feet, but your greatest weapon is going to be your arm. And if you can complete passes, you need to complete passes and not try and run the ball. And so I think we saw a lot more of that. I mean, he still ran for 80 yards, which I think that kind of just comes naturally, but he also threw for over 400. So I think Kingsbury would much rather have that part of it with it was something like an 80% completion rate or 76 or something like that. So he did much better on those short to intermediate passes and taking advantage of what the defense gave him, like running back screens and passes over the middle, and then we've got these 6'5" receivers, throwing the ball up to them. So that's just kind of, it makes the offense go a lot better whenever you do that as opposed to trying to be the hero.
Well, certainly I would encourage my quarterback as well to throw more if you have a Blitnikoff semifinalist in Antoine Wesley. And then, oh, by the way, Jadian High and T.J. Vasher are some pretty talented wide receivers as well. But you talked about Duffy's ability to use his legs, and what I was curious about is, so how does the tailback position weave into all of that? Is it good enough to complement both? If Duffy can be a threat to run it, but also you've got those talented wide receivers. How do the tailbacks sort of figure into the equation?
So the best tailback is a guy named Daleon Ward, and he's kind of been shelved for most of the year with just Kingsbury's never really fully elaborated, from a health issue what he had, but he's back healthy now, and I think that's been very beneficial for him. He's the team's best runner for sure, and having him healthy has been really good. But I've been very disappointed in the running game overall. It's been very stagnant, except for Duffy's leg. And I know that if you look at the team rushing totals, it looks really great, but that's really because Duffy's done such a great job. And so I'd love to see the offensive line, which is really kind of a veteran group, be more effective running the ball, but they just haven't done that. And Kingsbury mentioned today that, they kind of had a plan to run the ball, but then they were down 27-10, and they were like, well, we're not going to come back if we just keep running the ball. We need to, throw the ball and try and put some points on the board. So I'd be interested to see if they're able to establish a running game early against Kansas State, which I think would be beneficial because I can't remember. K-State has been really good at or been better against the run or the pass. I want to say it's better against the pass, but I just can't remember.
Yeah, it's a little bit more. We're a little better against the pass this year. Typically, it's been reverse, but I think that's because teams are finding they can run against this Kansas State defense. It's a bad tackling team this year, but certainly I think the opportunity does lend itself there for the Tech running game, maybe to have the potential to get going. But Seth, if I switch it over to the other side of the ball, if we start talking a little bit of defense, there's been a lot made out of how much better this Tech defense, what kind of strides they've made from year to year now in 2 consecutive years, really. Now, a little bit of that is, sadly, it's a bit of a relative term because of how bad it was 3 seasons ago, or 2 seasons ago, 3 years ago. But like I mentioned earlier, I do think as I've watched this Tech team, the way they're flying to the ball, that they don't seem to many times be outrun or out-athleted. At least, again, it's maybe a small sample size on my part, but we are 10 games in now. So from your perspective, like tangibly, what do you point to with this defense as being a clear improvement here in 2018 over 2017?
That's a really good question. The knock on the Tech defense has always been, boy, they look really incompetent, and they haven't looked incompetent this year. They look like a normal defense, and maybe the stats don't really play it out yet. But I think that they are comparable with most defenses in the Big 12. I mean, yeah, they give up some big plays, but who doesn't? So from my perspective, they've just been pretty solid. I think that they've been much better against the run. They have a very good defensive line and a very good linebacking core. If Dakota Allen is healthy, it's probably one of the better linebacking cores in the Big 12. If he's not, there's a couple guys there that are okay, and they're not as good as him, but they're still very serviceable. And I think, so there's depth at the linebacker spot, and I think there's also depth at the defensive line. I think where Tech has struggled is against the pass, where they've just been not very good at all, and they tend to give up really big plays. And again, that's probably why from the Big 12 to some extent. But it'd be nice, if we could kind of make some improvement there. But definitely the defensive line and the linebackers is where Tech is probably the best at defensively.
Well, from the Kansas State perspective, a lot of times the fan base here, we like to point to some like discipline categories, which is where we would, in the past, historically have really excelled in compared to Texas Tech. But entering this game, both teams are at a -2 turnover margin. Penalties seem to still be a little bit of a problem for Texas Tech, but special teams, these are usually the 3 categories I've had looked to over the course of when I was running my podcast. And, historically, again, K-State would excel in special teams, but what might be a little bit of a shock for Kansas State fans, I would say Texas Tech has the clear edge in special teams between the return capabilities of Daquan Bowman, and then, of course, your field goal kicker, Clayton Hatfield, is much more consistent than the Kansas State kicking team. I guess what I'll ask you, though, from your perspective, has special teams been a noticeable difference for you guys in 2018?
Yeah, it definitely has. So Tech hired a guy named Adam Shire, who was basically just kind of one of those assistants for Ohio State the past couple of years, where he gets paid to basically be kind of a guy that's an analyst more or less. He wasn't an assistant coach, and so Tech hired him, or Kingsbury hired him, and he's been really, really good. We had a horrible punting situation last year, and it's the same punter, but he had one bad game against Ole Miss, and then he's been fantastic the rest of the way. And the same thing with the kicker. Last year we had, Clayton Hatfield was our kicker, and he got injured early in the year, really didn't play at all before the season even started, and so we didn't have a reliable backup. Well, he's been healthy all year, so that makes a huge difference. On coverage and kick returns. We had a blocked punt against Iowa State. So there's just been a handful of really good plays, and that's always the hard thing about special teams because, the biggest goal is to not mess anything up. But if you can make a special play in those very limited plays that you actually do have, that's where you shine. And they've actually made some pretty good plays in those very limited opportunities that they've had. And so, it's been a total revelation. Adam Shire's been really, really good, and he's kind of got an interesting story. He is, his wife, I think, is a vet in North Carolina, so his family was all in North Carolina. He was in Lubbock during the season. I think he's going to go home during the off season and all that other good stuff. And his wife is a vet, and she has something like 30 animals at home or something ridiculous like that because she can't turn any animal away. So, he appears to be a really good guy and all those other good things. So, I think we've been really lucky to have him.
Well, I think if this game ends up being a tight ball game, I personally feel like I got to give the edge to Texas Tech for those reasons that we just outlaid. Special teams is gonna, if it comes down to a field goal, I'm liking Tech's chances. So we'll kind of end with that. The game prediction time. Everybody's podcast guest's favorite part of the podcast is having to throw out a prediction. But Seth, I'll weave in another question there, so if you want to take it a different direction and avoid the game prediction, that's fine as well. I believe that's what I did on your podcast. So if somehow K-State would pull off and I'll call it an upset, I guess, in this scenario, it has Cliff Kingsbury, he's been, unfortunately, his plateau's been kind of this 7-5 record. So if somehow, how do you see the game playing out? And if it didn't play out in the Texas Tech Red Raiders' favor, does Coach Cliff Kingsbury, after is it 6 years now? Does he make it to 2019's season kickoff?
Well, so I don't think that he does. Someone mentioned this in the comments earlier, that if Tech loses to Kansas State, that Tech and Kansas State have the exact same record. So tell me how you guys feel about how Kansas State has done this year. And so even though all these good things have happened, winning on the road against Oklahoma State and against TCU and whatever, I guess it could be really turned around really quickly if you lose to a team that you're expected to win by a touchdown or so. So I think the line opened at 8, and maybe it's down to 6.5 or 6. So that should tell you everything that you need to know right there. That you lose this game, and you have the exact same record as the Wildcats. So are you guys disappointed in the season, or are you ecstatic after a win, or are you still thinking, well, we probably still need to move on from Snyder? For me, I think that Texas Tech should win this game. It should be at least a touchdown win, I think, for Texas Tech. I think that they are that much better. There's so much that's going to be in play because it's senior day for Kansas State. I think the kids probably love playing for Coach Snyder to a certain extent. And so the emotional part of it is going to have to be, I think, a huge part of the deal. And I don't know how to weigh that. We can look at, S&P Plus and different things like that, and that can give you an idea, but sometimes this game's played on emotion so much that, I don't know how to determine how that plays out over the course of this game, because, I think that they would love to probably, put Snyder on their shoulders and marching out the stadium kind of thing. But, and that would be, of course, just so perfect in a bad sort of way as to how it would potentially end for Kingsbury. He really is loved at Texas Tech. I think that a lot of people really like him, but you've got to win. So.
Well, we'll see if the Wildcats can make it 4 straight against the Texas Tech Red Raiders in Manhattan. But Seth, I want to thank you for your time and thanks for coming on the show. I want to say that you were my first outside school interview when I started doing this crazy thing 5-6 years ago. So it seems a little poetic that you got to be my first guest to help kick off Season 5 on the EMAWdio podcast.
Well, hey, I really appreciate all the time that you've always given me, and I'm always happy to be on at any time.
So, Seth, before we send you off, just real quick for the listeners, if they want to catch up on any of your content, maybe follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle, and once again for the people, your website?
So the website is stakingtheplains.com, STAKING, theplains.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at SethC_J. That's SethC_J, and that's where you can find me.
That'll do it for this episode of the EMAWdio podcast. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Until next time, peace out.